So let's begin, everyone. We're going to look at Abraham again and focus on this narrative. And I've been thinking a great deal about Abraham and his significance, not only as a story and the first really lengthy story of any character in Scripture, but as the prototypical man of faith that we read about in Romans and elsewhere referred to in the New Testament. So Abraham's not just any character, which is apparent from hearing his story since he's the father of all nations, but there seems to be something archetypal about him and his story. And I think we can see the literary features of the story will amplify the theological meaning of the story, which I'm going to speak about as well, because Abraham, we're going to learn, is about the importance of Abraham as a father and a patriarch, and the importance of marriage in fulfilling his calling as this father of nations, and see how the story that is told is one of development, and the development goes from being the man that he was to the man that he needs to be for God to work out his purposes. And it's interesting to note that it comes right at the conclusion of the passage in which Genesis' saga of the universal human beginning. So Genesis 1 to 11 is sort of Urgeschichte, as they say in German, or sort of proto-history. Ur is not just the city in Babylon, it's the German word for early. I don't know if it's because of that, actually, or proto-history. But it's a sort of God's remedy to the attempts of humanity to create a universal human race represented by the city and the tower. And God disperses them, as we know, and adds confusion to their language. This is not the means by which God is going to work. He's going to work by means of something radically different from the city and everything it means. And he will hence forward work his ways out through one nation. Rather than all the nations of the earth and all the human race, there will be one nation. And this is God's path, and is through this man Abraham. Now, what's interesting is that in the context of that, there's an importance of human choice. It's not compulsion. The city of Babylon seemed to represent power and compulsion, and a lack of differentiation. There's a unanimity or univocity in their pursuits, whereas here there's a free choice of obedience. So freedom is important. There's a disposition towards holiness, which seems important. Abraham needs to learn to become holy, not like the nations around them, particularly not like Egypt, which will be the sort of antipode to him, represent the carnal, natural way of mankind. And also there'll be a need for a life that is guided by reverence and humility, for that matter. Abraham will have to learn, among other things, he will have to learn to listen to his wife, which is interesting, because he's a patriarch. And the word patriarchy has connotations about as bad as you can possibly get in our day. At least it's used seemingly regularly as a term of disparagement. And it's hard to find anyone who's even going to defend it. But I'm going to defend it today. But not in the sense of the way it is being used as a term of vilification, but the way that Scripture seems to be upholding patriarchy, at least as modeled by Abraham, because you can't defend it as it's being used to attack a certain abusive, toxic masculinity. That's indefensible. But it is defensible if we see Abraham as the patriarch, and not how he begins, but how he ends, and this as the representative of what God wants men to be like. at that point, then he is a patriarch, and he recognizes the importance of marriage, which it's going to take him time to do, and we're going to trace that. But also the right understanding of the male towards the female of the human race, and particularly one's wife. So there's a deep, and in this, it's not only a personal narrative, and this is interesting to me as well. Abraham, of course, when we think of Abraham as Christians, by faith, Abraham by faith, all of the list of those who've lived by faith, we tend to think of it individually because it is, of course, individuals. But in the case of Abraham, it also has political dimensions and cultural dimensions and religious dimensions, and all of those are a part of, to this day, I think, of a Christian life. There is a political dimension to the Christian faith. There is a familial dimension to the faith, and there's, above all, a marital basis for Christianity, and the importance of marriage and the covenant of marriage and honoring your wife or your husband as is appropriate. So the solid marriages, the family ties, these aren't just the means of perpetuating a tradition. So they're not a means to an end. They are actually the sum and substance, not the sum, but the substance of how this is going to go about. So it's not just the means to an end. It's vital to it. And I'm going to alert you to where I'm going to be getting a great deal of this. This wonderful book by Leon Kass, The Beginning of Wisdom, Reading Genesis. I came across Leon Kass a few years ago, not because of this course, but because of my interest in science fiction and subcreation and the bioethical issues and transhumanism and all that sort of stuff that some of you have heard me talk about. Leon Kass was the chairman of President Bush's bioethics committee back in the early 90s, argues against cloning and the experimentation on embryos and all sorts of really interesting things. He taught great books at Chicago for over 30 years, still alive, by the way, and began as a medical doctor and moved into a teaching role, and to me is one of the wisest men you'll ever read about. So I encourage you to read everything you can by him.
How do you spell his last name?
Kass. A Jewish man. Yes.
I have a question. I'm just wondering, is it illegal right now to do things like the testing on embryos and stuff like that?
Is it illegal?
Yeah.
I'm not sure there are any laws. There are some laws that were brought about at the time. Because of that commission at the time, the experimentation on embryos was severely curtailed in the U.S. And there was a huge hue and cry at the time because it was already proceeding in Europe. And the American scientists said, well, we're going to fall behind on this. And, you know, if you're in the name of religion, you are harming the future of the human race because these experiments will lead to new scientific discoveries, et cetera, et cetera. But they did place firewalls around the experimentation at the time.
It's interesting if that were to be curtailed, or like, I don't know, if they tried to like prevent that from happening, but
well, yeah, so the argument was that we can curtail it here, but we can't curtail it elsewhere. As we speak, there are attempts to clone human beings. There was something called Dolly the sheep that was back in the 90s, mid-90s. The first sheep was cloned from another one, and talk about cloning human beings. It's going on right now, in China in particular, but elsewhere in the world. So that's what they just said. Then other people will do it. The means are available there to start that. There's also all sorts of bioethical issues like surrogacy, which happens all the time. You know, a woman has her embryo as a host for other people's children and so forth. All the ethical issues surrounding it are, they sort of lag behind the ability to do it. We can do it, so we do it, and then after we've done it, then we think about, what are the consequences of this? You know, for the child, for instance. But at present, you can pay people to be surrogates. In Canada, I know of people who do it, and some people do it regularly. They think it's great. Some people like to be mothers. or at least they like to bear children. They're not mothers, by the way, they bear children. If they give the baby away, they're not mothers. They're child bearers. Mother is somebody who cares for the well-being of the child long after the child's born. Same thing with a father. Anybody can get a girl pregnant. I shouldn't say anybody, but it's a lot harder to be a father than it is to get somebody pregnant.
Well, in
Yes?
Canada, paid surrogacy is illegal. You can only do altruistic surrogacy, and you don't do it for pay.
Yeah. So the payment. So yeah, sure, you can do it altruistically. So that for the good. Who's good? When you say you can't do it for pay, does the pay not take place outside of that? It may or it may not. But for the altruistic purposes, begs the question, for the good, who's good? The people who want to have a child, okay? Anyway, I don't want to get into the bioethics here, because that will really get me in the deep water. And I'm not concerned about being in the deep water, but it's going to take me off topic. We're already veering that way immediately, because these things are so important in our day. But we will find that in the story of Abraham, the importance of marriage and family is intrinsic to God's purposes. It's not just a means to an end. Yes? Yes, it is. Yeah. So we'll come to that, more or less. It's acceptable in the day, so that the question is whether Hagar is an instance of early surrogacy, and it is. So she's the property of Abraham and Sarai, and they want to have a child, or they've been told that one of Abraham's own seed will be the means to bring about this wonderful kingdom. And so Sarai, who is barren, suggests, how about Hagar? And she'll bear the child for me. And it'll be my child. I'll own it, more or less. She finds it's not quite so simple when it comes to actually having the child. How does that work and so forth? But yes. And Abraham's very happy with that. He doesn't regard the child as, by the way, he doesn't seem to have any particular attraction to Hagar. It's just she's a means to an end. Oh, she'll bear the seed, there you go. Yeah. So it's commodifying humanity is what it's doing. It's making people into things, means to an end. It's implicitly condemned in the passage. And we're going to come to, as I said, to patriarchy at the end of it all. Patriarchy needs to be understood in the biblical sense. It's not a biblical word, by the way. Patriarchy is a Greek word. Patria, or family, or pater, father, is combined with arche, which is a ruler. A patriarch is either a father ruler or a means of family or clan rule. It's not a Hebrew word. It's a Greek word. But the idea of it is a family-based solution to the problems of politics, which the story of Babel represents. So rather than top-down, Tower of Babel impose a uniformity on all life, we'll do it from the bottom up, from families. That begs the question of what a family is, and it's also going to become, out of the story of Abraham, what it means to be a father. And a father is not bearing children. That's not a father. Fatherhood entails far more than that. And that the sense of what a father entails is something that comes out of the story, and something that Abraham himself has to learn. And the case is made by Cass himself, and I refer you to that book because he talks about it in multiple chapters, and I'm talking about it in one lecture, and he's got a lot more detail than I'm going to present. The headings that I put up here are from that book, by the way. I think it's quite useful. It's the literary framework, but it's not just the literary framework. It, to some degree, is the thematic framework for the whole of the story of Abraham, which runs from Genesis 11 towards the end of it all the way to Genesis 25. And it's surrounded by, what do we have? We have 11 trials, 10 divine encounters, and then there are other divine deeds on the right-hand column, which seem to take place without Abraham's knowledge even, all of which are interesting. So Abraham's the means to do certain things. The development of Abraham as a character happens because, as I said last time, that there is a consequential narrative here. So there's a series of events, but each one is a consequence of the next one. It's not just a sequence, it's a consequence. Because of the decision that was made here, now God can move on with Abraham and he'll move to the next trial, as it were. And when he passes it or he fails it, there's a consequence to it. And he will learn something from this. So the result of it is that what we are seeing in the story of Abraham, the great hero, is the education of Abraham in what it means to be a follower of Yahweh and to be a husband and to be a father, but particularly those two. Three things, I guess. What it means to be a follower of this God who calls him. Number two, what it means to be a husband, and what it means to be a father. And he does have to learn all three of those. His story is a quarter of the whole of the book of Genesis. Almost all of the account falls between the 75th year of his life, when he is called, to the time that he gains a wife by his, a daughter by, or he gets a wife for his son Isaac, which takes place 65 years later. So that's interesting. That's an interesting sort of framework right there. At the age of 75, his story begins in Genesis. 65 years later, he finally succeeds in finding a son, or rather a wife for his son Isaac. Not just somebody who'll bear his children, but somebody who'll be a wife for him. Really important in the story. So he's going to learn about not only God's ways, but how he is to develop as a man. So as Cass puts it, Abraham goes to school. God himself is his major teacher, and Abraham's adventures constitute his education right up to his final exam, the binding of Isaac. At which point, after that, God speaks to him no more. Pass the test. Now you're ready to be the father of nations that you were called to be right from the beginning. So these 11 chapters, the first 11 chapters of Genesis demonstrate the troubles that households have between a man and a woman. We get all sorts of illustrations of this. We get the problems that fall between brothers. We get them between parents and children. Think of Noah and his sons. Right, when Noah gets drunk and one of his sons, Ham, mocks him, for which reason Canaan is cursed, and the kids are dispersed and so forth. We get patricide, the killing of fathers. We get fratricide, the killing of brothers. We get misogyny all over the place. These are the problems with humanity that seem to be natural to humanity. The story of Abraham is going to show us the different path that God is going to commend, and what he is commending, among other things, is marriage, which is not a natural, seemingly a natural state. When I say not a natural state, it becomes natural in Lewis's rendition of the Tao. So marriage is commended in all the major religions, which is true. But it was not always so. And it is not natural for people to be married and to be committed to monogamy and committed to being a husband and committed to being a father. These things are not natural. To be natural is to do whatever you want and to be uncommitted to anything but yourself and your own power. It's a fascinating case that Cass makes here. But the sequence is important. So we only hear about these episodes, but the episodes, as I say, one has to happen for the next to happen, and so on down the line. But I'll get into that right now. So let me do that. Oh, and one final comment. This is a really interesting comment. This is from Cass as well. So note this. Abram belongs to the 10th generation after Noah, the last generation that would have known him personally, the second Adam, as it were, right? That God blots everything out. We're going to begin with this man and his family. According to biblical chronology, Abram is born in 1948, not AD. In the beginning, if we start at year 0, it's 1948 years when Abram is born. Like, you know what I'm talking about now? I'm not talking about chronology, AD, BC, any of that. If you, from the very beginning, I guess it would be, no, it wouldn't, because BC is going again from the time of year 0. It's marked from the very beginning of the creation of all things in the year 1948. From that, Abram is born, and at that point, Noah is still alive. He dies in 2006 by that reckoning. So there's about 60 years where they would have had an acquaintance with one another. So he would be the last of that generation that would have known Noah. And Noah would have been the first man who could not have known Adam, the first one. So with this, and these, as he says, these biographical facts have symbolic, moral, political meaning, whereas Noah, the new man, represents a clean break with the man from the Garden of Eden. Abram will build on the foundations begun with Noah. So enough time has transpired that now we have no natural, when I say natural, first-hand acquaintance with the individual Adam, and we do have individual first-hand acquaintance with Noah, but the very last man who would have it. So it's 10 generations have passed after Noah, and that's interesting, just that on its own. I've never really looked at the chronology of the years and said, well, who would have been alive at what point here? But that would have been it. How does the story of Abram begin? And who is Abram? Well, note when he starts off, he's childless, he's rootless, he has no homeland, he may be godless, he is a devoted firstborn son of an old wanderer and a radical. Terah is his name. And he's left the land of his birth, because he's been given a promise. What's the promise? Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those that bless you and curse those who curse you, etc. Fascinating point here. I always assumed that Abram had a sense that this was God and he was doing it out of a sense of godliness. Cass makes the case, and I think it's not actually, not only did I not think it's implausible, I think it's actually entirely likely. Abram goes because he's an ambitious man. He's been told that he will be a great man. So he's willing to risk everything and leave. Sure, because he's been told he'll be great. He's young enough, ambitious enough to think, this is great. I want to be great. I want to make a name for myself. And note that there's a sevenfold promise there. I'll put that text there. there's two parts to the speech. The Lord says to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And then there's sevenfold promise. I will make of you a great nation, firstly, and I will bless you, number 2, and I will make your name great, number 3, and you will be a blessing, number 4, and I will bless those that bless you, number 5, and harm him or curse or dishonor those who dishonor you, and finally, seventhly, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So sevenfold promise if he does this, and he does it. It's not just a command, it's a command with all sorts of promises. Do this, which is a crazy, difficult thing to do, and if you do that, you will get all these benefits. Abraham goes. It could be because he's a godly man, or it could just be because he's very ambitious. And he's willing to set aside everything. And that is closer to the case because we can see what he does with his sister wife right away. What's he willing to do? Sacrifice her. Does he treat his wife as his wife? Or does he treat her as somebody who might, he may need to sacrifice for the purpose that he's left his homeland for? He's going to change very much. His tune on how he's to relate to his wife is going to entirely change. We're not told what his motivation is, by the way. That's an important thing to note. So nothing definitive can be said on that. Like all of what I've said about the text in Scripture, motivations are almost always silent. We're left to infer them. But he will undergo these 11 trials, and the 11 trials... These 11 trials are going to be the crucible in which Abram's character is formed as husband and as father. So what's the first one? God, out of the blue, calls him to a sevenfold blessing if he goes forth. This is the first trial. Will he do it? He does do it. When he goes to Canaan, he finds that there are Canaanites there already. And he's a little bit confused. You told me to go to this land. There are already people there. How am I going to become a great nation if that's the case? Second trial. When a famine strikes, he goes to Egypt. He's not called to go to Egypt. He goes there on his own. By the way, this is on the course website if you are worried about writing it down. It's there for your access. He goes to Egypt, and there his wife Sarai is imperiled by Pharaoh. What does Abram do with his wife? He says, tell him that you're my sister so that he won't kill me. What does she do? She goes along with it. Why? By the way, what do we know about Sarai? We don't know who her parents are, first of all, but what does her name mean? Well, we know she's beautiful. What else do we know about her? What does her name mean? Princess, I think. Milcah's queen. He comes out of this trial, so he goes there on his own. God doesn't tell him to go there. And he comes out of it wealthy. What will he learn from this episode? Does he learn to love his wife? Or does he learn that it is profitable to put your wife out there when your life's at stake? I mean, he could come away with that conclusion. There's no reason to think that he now understands that he did the wrong thing. Pharaoh rebukes him for it, but it doesn't seem that Abraham has learned that lesson. Yes?
I just looked up what Sarai means. It does mean princess, but it also means contentious and quarrelsome.
Okay. I don't see that here in the text. The contentious, quarrelsome. Right? I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying that doesn't seem an indication of her character. Neither does princess, I guess. to be fair. That's the next one. So he returns to from Egypt, a very wealthy man, at which point he calls on the name of the Lord. So he's learned to reverence God out of that. And he builds a tower at Bethel, house of God. By the way, when he leaves, and this is another interesting point, when he leaves he leaves with his nephew Lot, who is, remember, he's 75 years old and his wife's barren. He probably sees his nephew as his heir. That's the guy. Right? Because his wife's not going to have any children at that point. He doesn't think that it's the case. And yet he stays with this wife who won't bear him any children. Why does he stay with her? Because she's pretty. She's beautiful, apparently. It's not because he loves her, or at least it doesn't seem to be, because he's willing to let her become a concubine of Pharaoh. She's not the mother of his children. She's beautiful. He sticks with her. That's fine. And she is willing to let herself be used in that way. So both of them are going to learn something about themselves along the way, by the way. He's going to learn to value her, and she's going to learn to value herself in the whole exchange. So the worth of the individual beings are going to become of great significance in the text. Thirdly, there will be a trial when he has trouble with Lot, and he has to part ways with him. The two of them amicably separate. Abraham actually even magnanimously gives him the first choice of territory, and interestingly, Lot chooses the plains that look a heck of a lot like Egypt, which is a den of iniquity. It says a lot about Lot there, although we're told in the New Testament that he's spoken of as righteous Lot, which is interesting. But when Abraham seems to be willing to let God determine his future, he's learned something about trusting God. So that aspect of it comes forth, and at that point, God promises him that he'll have seed as numerous as the grains of dust on the earth. Fourth challenge: he's captured in a war, that is Lot. Military conflict by the invading Babylonian kings and against the local Canaanite kings and their minions. So this fourth trial comes when Abraham has to come and fight a military battle on behalf of his kinsmen. And at this point, he gives up his the spoils of victory. He could have whatever he wants. He decides that he won't do this. Right? He's not going to claim everything he could have claimed. And he will give some to this priest strange priest by the name of Melchizedek, who then disappears from the scene, doesn't get mentioned again to the book of Hebrews. Very odd passage. Fifthly, but at this point, he expresses for the first time a desire for children. Because remember, Lot could have been his heir at that point, just by adoption. It's my brother. Remember, I mean, the covenantal obligations in accordance with the law are not yet there. So it's your brother's son. He doesn't have to adopt him as an heir, but he could do it, and apparently he was considering doing it, so he brings him along. At this point, they're going to part ways, so then he's anxious. Lot seems to not really want to serve my ends. He seems to be establishing himself on his own. Now Abram's anxious about who's going to be my heir. So the first time he cries out to God in this passage, or after this passage, who is going to be my progeny? And that's the Genesis 15, when he says it will be from your own loins. Okay. New information. He had not been given that before. It will come directly from you. So he wants children. At that point, he then comes to the thought, but Sarai's barren. So who's it going to be? Sarai also hears the same thing. It's going to be from Abram's loins, but I can't be the means for that to come about. So who is it going to be? The Egyptian girl. We'll let her do it. It's Sarai's suggestion. Abram says, okay. Then Ishmael, even before he can be born, Abram almost loses his heir because of a family strife. Because Sarai is so jealous that she boots out Hagar, goes into the wilderness. So another conflict. And Abram comes to regard Ishmael as his heir. He thinks he's it, because this is the son of his loins. This is his seed. Now, at this point, and it's right in the middle of the story, of the whole story of Abraham, Ishmael is right on the cusp of manhood. God appears to Abraham, the fifth encounter here, with a promise and a command. And what's the promise and the command? Circumcise. It's right in the center of the story. Of all of the trials, the covenant of circumcision. So circumcision is at the flex point, or if you will, the chiasmus in literary terms of the story. So there are 11 trials. The sixth one is the crucial one, in a sense. Yes?
Forgive me, how do you spell chiasmus?
No. It's from the Greek letter chi, C-H-I, which looks like an X. So it's the point at which the lines intersect. That's the chiasmus. It's sort of a chiastic structure. So what is said here will be repeated here, and what's here will be here, and so forth. That's a chiastic structure. Very common in Hebrew narrative. And here it's also matched thematically by the covenant of circumcision, which is will follow for all Israel. It will be a mark of their covenant with God. So he says, walk before me and be wholehearted. So the covenant, he says be wholehearted. So the covenant's really about his heart, which is important because when we get to the New Testament, there's the covenant is a new heart. It's about being wholehearted and devoted to God. But walk before me, be wholehearted, and then he offers him a binding and eternal covenant with him and his seed. And then the mark is on the means of generation, which is the foreskin. Right, the moment of procreation, the means of generation, this will be the mark. And at this point, the promise that he'd been given is now amplified significantly. He will become the father of many nations and the progenitor of kings. The land will be an everlasting possession. That was not said before. And the Lord will be his and their God always. Always. And his father, his name goes from Abram to Abraham at this point. So at this crucial point when the covenant of circumcision is given. At that point, he gets a new name. And for the first time, he's told that his wife, who is barren and 89 years of age, will bear him a son whose name is Isaac. And that will be your true heir. And all he has to do is circumcise himself. I guess you need that sort of divine incentive to circumcise yourself as an adult. I'm not rushing out to do that. Yeah. He and all the members of his household. That's the sixth trial. He does it right away. After he does this, the Lord appears to him as strangers in a tent. So these are the divine visitors, the three visitors that come to the tent. And at this point, they are checking his capacity for hospitality. So here's the covenant, here's your nation, and now how do you treat strangers? That's interesting. right immediately after that. So it's just, so here's the covenant, it's with you and it's with future generations, it will be with Israel. But how is Israel going to relate to strangers? This is going to be tested in how they are receiving their visitors. Are you willing to treat outsiders well? And he passes the test. The eighth trial is when Abraham is faced with the problem of Lot and Sodom. God's resolved to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. What is Abraham going to do? Abram has to argue with him. In the end, Abram has to agree to God's plan of destruction, having whittled him down to a certain point. But he agrees to do it, and he saves Lot for Abram's sake. Ninth trial. He wanders to the land of the Philistines. This is really strange. And he allows Sarah to be taken by Abimelech, the king of Gerar. I don't even know how it's pronounced. Is it Gerar or Gerar? I was once... Gerar. I was once told it doesn't matter. Just say it with conviction and as if you know, and then everyone will be fine. So I shouldn't have been doubtful. Just pretend you know what you're saying. Because after all the points put on afterwards, nobody really knows. So just be forceful and pretend. God intervenes again. Now this is God's intervention. He sends a dream to Abimelech and rescues Sarah. That's interesting. This time through a dream, and Abimelech compels Abraham to acknowledge that he had treated his wife wrongly. So he hadn't learned. Even now, this is the mother of the child, but you're willing to let her. So yeah, she's going to bear the seed. He only cares about the seed. He doesn't care about the wife. It's extraordinary. His eyes are on the prize. What's the prize? It's to have this great nation. But his wife is a means to an end there. Remember, she's also his sister. What does it mean for, how should a man treat his wife? Here's how not to do it. And you get to the point where he says, oh, this is how to do it. There's a long passage there for him. Remember, he's going to be a means to demonstrate the opposite to what has been taught in the nations before that point. Here's how a man ought to treat his wife. He starts off in not a good place. And over time, he gradually learns that his wife, to whom he is married, is crucial and essential to his mandate. He must treat his wife with total respect and love. The 10th trial is when he's under pressure from Sarah, who wants to defend her little boy Isaac against his brother Ishmael, treating him badly, tells Abraham, get him out, get rid of him. Abraham does not want to do it because this is his firstborn. It is his firstborn. It's not the one through whom he will be the father of all nations, but it's still his firstborn. He doesn't want to do it. What does he do? You tell me, what does he do?
For Ishmael?
Yeah.
He takes him to the wilderness and sends him off wandering.
He does what his wife says. And God says, in fact, God tells him to do what his wife says. Listen to your wife. Obey your wife, in fact. There's interesting. So he goes from he's the commander-in-chief and he can dispense with his wife. She's there, but he's got this great dominion call to be the father of all nations. And the wife, yeah, she's there, but she's barren. She's not part of the purposes. He learns that his wife is essential to being God's man. And you obey her, which isn't to say that he does not. It's not a headship issue. It's a relationship issue. with respect to how the children are to be treated, the husband will listen to his wife. She has as much authority as he does, and she's more interested in the future. These are the children that she bears. So again, God's teaching along there. Now think about that in the context of the importance of education and the importance of fatherly example and the relationship to the wife. And think of all the ways in which Sarai goes from thinking of herself as being basically incidental. She's eye candy for Abraham at the outset. She's willing to prostitute herself basically for his sake, to the point where she realizes that she is an indispensable part of God's plan and that she is to be listened to in relation to her children, and they be properly educated in his ways. These are all lessons that come out of the story of Abraham, which are also lessons for the church and for every individual. So Abraham, the man of faith, isn't only marked by the fact that he has faith in God, but by the lessons he learns as the man of faith. The final one is the most crucial one of all, because now everything's fixed. His family's in order. His neighbors aren't threatening him. God is happy with him and has given him an heir. The Lord asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Bind him up. Remember, this is the son, according to God's own promise, who will be the bearer of the lasting covenant. This guy, no one else. This one. Not the man he's just sent off packing. This one. I want you to bind him and sacrifice him. He walks for 3 days to do it. What does he do? He binds him on the altar. And then a messenger comes along and rescues him. And at that point, he will be given the blessing that the promises that your seed will be as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sand upon the seashore. His seed will have victory over their enemies, and they will be a blessing to all nations of the earth. Now, he is willing to renounce that promise out of reverence for the one who gives the promises. Now, this is interesting. Now he's no longer doing it for what he's going to get for himself. He's doing it for God. That's the final lesson. Right? Because up to this point, he could have been doing it all for selfish reasons. It's so that he will have a great name, in which case he would have been just like the people in the Tower of Babel, to make a name of themselves. Well, he's been told he's going to be a great man. He could be doing it for that sake. But now he's willing to sacrifice the means by which his name will be great because he loves God more than his own name. At that point, he passes the test. And distinguishes himself from the foregoing example of the Tower of Babel. Power, it's a means to an end. You can do anything. So at that point, Abraham's education is complete. And as I say, God doesn't speak to him again. You're done. And then the rest of the story of Abraham is, how am I going to find a suitable wife for my son, Isaac? There's a lot of text that deals with that. Finding a suitable wife for Isaac. Because now he needs a wife. He doesn't need somebody who's going to bear his children. Those are easy to find. Lots. They could be. He wants somebody that will be able to will carry on the worship of this God and will understand how to relate to her husband, and he will treat her as a wife. That's what he's looking for. It's got to be somebody suitable. Isn't that interesting? Now, this is just the story, but the consequential nature of them, but also what develops out of it. Abraham learns what it's like to be a father as well. It's not just having a child, it's treating him well. And part of being a father is treating your wife with respect. Because this is your wife, and it's also the mother of your children. He has to also learn how to be a husband. All of these things are learned from this story. And from that, if you think about it and you expand it to the New Testament, how important are those lessons for the church as the household of faith? You know, fathers and children, husbands and wives. It's all over the place. And the covenant of circumcision here will be the covenant of faith. But it's the pivotal axis point. But all of the family and being a good husband and being a good father, that's there. And teaching your children what God is like, that's at the heart of Deuteronomy 6. Right? So what does God say to the people who've been brought out of the land of Egypt? He says, you're to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your strength. And you're to love your neighbor as yourself. That's right there in what you're to teach your children and to remember what God did. So you're teaching them who God is and how you treat other people. And you're to teach your children this. So there's a commitment to the future and to some degree to those who are weaker than you. And it's certainly the case with children, but also with wives. How do you treat those who are weaker? Are they co-partners, or are they means for you to fulfill your career ambitions? Yes?
How would they then have viewed the role of a husband and a wife with more than one wife? Like, how would they?
Well, they're
view the
plainly
role of a
learning. They're
wife?
plainly learning here that there's one. It's not explicit yet. But this is the means by which God's sovereign plan was carried out. It was through that one wife, even the one who was barren. That's your wife. You can't take another just for the sake of having heirs. That is your wife. It's already implicit in Genesis, but we're told nothing about what a husband-wife relationship entails. That it's a male and a female. But how do they relate to one another? How do they regard one another? How does the wife treat the husband? How does the husband treat the wife? That's not made clear in the text at all. As I say, Genesis 1 to 11 is littered with bad examples. Now we are given somebody who starts off as a bad example and eventually becomes the example of exactly how he should behave. And then Isaac is a good dad, and then we'll eventually get to Jacob, who's a lover of his wife. He waits 14 years for her. And he's a good dad. For all of his character flaws, he doesn't exhibit the character flaws of faithlessness to God. He loves his wife. And he loves his children. Devotes himself to them. And these are patriarchs. This is what patriarchy is. Really interesting. So it's not the portrait of so-called toxic masculinity. It's the exact opposite. It's a sort of a self-sacrificing, wife-loving, future-honoring man. That's patriarchy. And the other patriarchs follow in the same model. So he is the model father. He's both of his family and of his people, and he's even willing to sacrifice his son. Now, this is problematic. You say, okay, well, he's the model of the father. Are fathers really supposed to sacrifice their sons? The answer is clearly not, because God prevents it from happening. But what the point here is he is willing to do everything for the sake of the good and the true and the beautiful. What is best? He's going to do it for the author of such things. For righteousness' sake, he's willing to do anything and everything. He learns that. He loves the teacher of all this righteousness that he's been given, even more than his own fame. None of us, fortunately, will ever be faced with the choice of having to sacrifice their own son for the sake of that. But we are supposed to be willing to do everything for God. Everything good. So he's the example of the proper father whose love of his own children puts everything into right order. So everything in his life is going to be put behind those ambitions. And remember, this is a hero. Abram's a hero. He has left his country willing to do these things. That's not an ordinary individual. And this is a fascinating point. Again, this is Cass's point. I'll read it to you because it's so good. Truth be told, all of us fathers devote, that is, sacrifice, in scare quotes, our sons to some god or other, to mammon or Moloch, to honor or money, pleasure or power, or worse, to no God at all. True, we do so less visibly and less concentratedly, but we do so willy-nilly through the things we teach and respect in our own homes. We intend that the entire life of the sons be spent in service to our own ideals or idols, and in this sense we do indeed spend or try to spend the life of our children. So there are the means for us, so we ignore them and their needs, and we put our own needs first. So we're sacrificing them to whatever gods we have, our career, our entertainment needs, whatever. So that's what he's talking about. He says, but a true father will devote his son to and will self-consciously and knowingly initiate him into only the righteous and godly ways. He will understand that, like Abraham and unlike Noah, only a father who feels awe before the true source can deserve the filial awe, that is the awe of their children, and reverence of his sons by showing his willingness to sacrifice what is his for what is right and good and highest. He also puts his son on the proper road for his own adulthood, the true test of the good father. Will he show him Jesus? Will he be willing to put everything else aside so that that is the center? Will he be giving him that education that will make God preeminent in all areas of life? Will he show him those things? Not just tell him, but will he demonstrate it in his life? Abraham ends up doing that. So he doesn't love his son only because it's his son. He loves him because his son is his responsibility to bring to the Lord. He's a blessing from God. By the way, the women are also taught a lesson. They're taught not to be proud of their own capacity for having children, which is why they're struck with barrenness for so long. They realize that children are a gift from the Lord and a heritage. 3 of the wives of the patriarchs are barren for significant periods of time, so that they don't think it's just, well, here's how it works. You have children, they just pop out. You have sex, children pop out. There you go. Look at what I'm able to do. No. They're struck with barrenness. They realize that it's entirely a gift from God. That's the lesson they learn. Now, the lesson is fortunately not one that every person has to learn, but it's taught there in Scripture, and it's kept for our knowledge to know that children are a heritage from the Lord, a gift, and to be treasured as such. So those things are really interesting parts of the narrative. Comments or questions here? And then I go back to the chiastic structure. Yes?